The best of money matters. The big story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin, Jeong. Singapore will be considering caning as punishment for serious scam-related offences as it steps up enforcement action following record losses. Now, that's according to Minister of State for Home Affairs Sun Xueling, who announced this on March 4th in her speech during the debate over the Ministry of Home Affairs budget. Now, this comes as scam victims here in Singapore lost a record $1.1 billion in 2024. That's the first time scam losses crossed the $1 billion mark in a year. In total, victims in Singapore have lost more than $3.4 billion to scams since 2019. So are the current measures aimed at tackling the growing problem of scams ineffective? And will the introduction of caning as punishment in relation to scam offences be effective in reducing scam activities here in Singapore? Well, joining us today is Benjamin Joshua Ong, who is the Assistant Professor of Law at Yong School of Law at Singapore Management University. Professor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Hongbin.
All right, Professor, what are your thoughts on the proposed policy of considering caning for certain scam-related offences in Singapore? Do you think this is an appropriate response to the growing issue of scams?
Well, to start, I'd like to stress that it's a proposed step, right? The government hasn't come out and said they will do it. And I think that's significant because it's potentially challenging. To begin with, to regulate something by law, you have to define it, right? Now, I suppose the closest analogy that comes to mind is the law on unlicensed money lending, or as it's colloquially known, loan sharking. You can have a clear definition of that, right? But scamming, by contrast, that word could be a small-time person deceiving someone to hand over $150 for concert tickets that don't exist, all the way to $1 million scams, right? And of course, whenever we talk about punishments, we've got to talk about proportionality. It can't be that the worst punishment has got to apply to everyone who is involved in any crime, including scams, no matter how great or small.
I see. Well, Minister of State for Home Affairs, Ms. Sun Xueling, has said that Singapore is considering introducing caning as a punishment for scammers in severe cases, recognizing the significant harm they cause. What are considered severe cases in this case, then?
So I suppose, once again, coming back to the analogy with loan sharking, right? So if you look at the punishments available, there's a sort of tier according to the severity as well as your role in the whole system, right? So if you're the person who is in charge of, for example, a loan sharking syndicate, you could get the most serious sentences compared to someone who is, just playing a lower role in the syndicate, so to speak, such as being one of the so-called runners. Now, that having been said, the punishments are still pretty stiff. And I think the analogy you want to look at here is the punishments for loan shark harassers, right? So you get up to 6 strokes of the cane, but if you harass someone on behalf of a loan shark and you damage property, that's 3 to 6 strokes, 5 to 8 strokes if someone was hurt, and 6 to 12 strokes if it's both. So I think that gives us a sense, right? If we transpose it to the context of scams, what counts as a severe case? The relevant factors would include your blameworthiness in the offense, the severity in terms of the amount scammed, the manner of scamming, as well as whether perhaps there's some kind of physical element to it.
I see. Well, so for some context here, what are the current punishments for scam offenses?
So there are a number of offenses that have to do with scam. To scam someone itself, the technical term for that is cheating. The punishment for that, it starts with 3 years jail or a fine or both, and then it goes up. If it involves inducing someone to hand over property such as money, the maximum sentence is 10 years or a fine. So no caning. All right. There are also other offenses that are related to scams. So, for example, if you supply someone else's personal information without their consent in order to aid in cheating, that's 3 years jail. Receiving stolen property, which includes property that came about through a scam, knowing that it's stolen, 5 years, 20 years if you're carrying on. The technical term is dealing in stolen property habitually. So it's a fine or jail, and these can be rather long sentences indeed, but no caning as yet.
I see. Well, Professor, for caning to be proposed as a form of punishment here, does this signal that the current policy measures tackling the growing problem of scams in Singapore are ineffective?
So when we talk about tackling any problem, including scams, it's not just a binary question of is it effective or not. right? That you've got to use multiple tools to tackle each problem. Now, that having been said, you can kind of see the logic behind wanting to introduce caning, which is basically the harsher the punishment, the greater the deterrent, right? And again, coming back to the analogy with loan sharking, so we started in 1959 with a law saying you need a license to carry on a money lending business. And then various punishments increased over the decades, fines, jail terms. In 1993, for the first time, debt collectors, the so-called debt collectors for the loan sharks, could be sentenced to caning, and then the number of strokes of caning has gone up. Now, is this because the laws on illegal money lending were ineffective? I wouldn't say they were ineffective, so much as not effective enough given new developments, right, in the face of illegal money lending, the tactics that are used. So similarly as with scams, it's not necessarily that the existing laws aren't good enough, but rather that there is an improvement that can be made because, you can always do better when it comes to fighting a complex problem like this.
I see. So why do you think the government has proposed caning as a punishment for scam-related crimes? Is there evidence that suggests caning would be an effective deterrent for scams?
Well, to start with, it's not exactly a government proposal. They said they'd consider it. But, we do know that caning is a deterrent against crime generally, right? And why why consider caning? If you look at the kind of offences that caning is available for as a punishment, they are generally either offences that have an element of physical hurt or violence, or those that involve a very serious offence against a very personal interest. So, for example, molestation or voyeurism. Or those that involve certain very serious offences involving property, such as vandalism or robbery or that sort of thing. And, of course, on that list, I should add, again, loan shark harassment, right? So you can really see the analogy. In terms of evidence that would be deterrent, I don't think any evidence exists for the simple reason that I know of no legal system in the world where caning is a punishment for scamming. But you can certainly imagine how it would be a deterrent.
I see. Well, could there be alternative policy measures that may be more effective in tackling the growing problem of scams here in Singapore other than caning?
So it's not a matter of more or less effective, right? These are all different tools in a toolbox that fight the problem of scams. So caning is part of the system of punishing the scammers, but there are many more tools available, right? Things such as stepping up policing efforts, which is why the police have set up a specialized department called the Anti-Scam Command, public education efforts, cybersecurity measures, and so on. So it's not a matter of, caning instead of these things, or, one is better than the other. They are all different parts of the system that we use to tackle the problem.
I see. So let's say the government does indeed, introduce caning as a form of punishment for scam-related offenses. How might the public perceive this type of introduction as a punishment?
Knowing the Singaporean public, I suppose it will be pretty much welcomed, given the sheer extent of harm that scams have caused. You can see why it would certainly cause public disquiet if you were to introduce caning for a relatively minor offense, such as littering. But if you look at the nature of scamming, not just the harm it causes, but also the fact that it's frequent, it's happening more and more, and it takes place in a very organized manner. My guess is that the public, if it accepts caning for things like loan sharking offenses, will pretty much be happy to. If anything, I guess many Singaporeans will say, why so late?
I see. Well, Singapore is up against highly organized and sophisticated criminal networks, which are well-resourced, adept at using technology, and constantly evolve, their tactics. So given that scams are often, perpetrated by individuals in a digital and sometimes anonymous environment, do you think that this type of punishment like caning addresses the root causes of scam activities, or does it simply punish the symptom rather than the cause?
Well, in theory, you could have a law that says that you are... I'm sure if this law is to be adopted, it would apply to the people who are masterminding the scam.
Right.
Now, of course, as you rightly point out, if that person is probably anonymous, hiding in some other country, which for reasons best known, it shelters them or doesn't do it, allows them to get away with it. But I don't think that proposals like this aim to, as you say, address the root cause of scam activities, right? Just like, again, the laws on loan shark harassment. So the idea is not to root out, if I may, the plant that is scamming or loan sharking, but rather to perhaps cut off some of the branches or pluck off some of the leaves so as to prevent the plant from having the means of gaining food. So the idea is that if you are the person who's masterminding the scam operation of drug trafficking or loan sharking, you would find it, in theory, harder to find people to carry out these activities physically because the would-be loan shark runners or scam underlings or whatever would feel more apprehensive. They'd really think twice before agreeing to do it.
Right. Well, then, given that many scams now involve international networks as well, how would the government also enforce penalties or of caning for overseas scammers who might never step foot in Singapore?
Yeah, that's a tricky thing, right? So again, when it comes to loan shark harassment, even if the mastermind, so to speak, is overseas, the harassment is a physical act. So there is a person physically in Singapore that you can, who's under our jurisdiction, who you can go after. If it takes place overseas, things are trickier. You can, of course, have the punishment for the offences if they're committed in Singapore, but it may well be, especially when it's done over the internet, that the act of scamming itself doesn't take place in Singapore. And so what the government, I suspect, will want to do is to relook and perhaps toughen the laws on scamming related offences, offences that can be used to carry out the scam as sort of an intermediate step. So, for example, if you were to hand over your bank account details or your SingPass details to someone when you have reason to believe that it's going to be used for criminal activities, currently that's already a crime. It gets jail, it's jail and or a fine. The government will want to rethink that. Now, the tricky thing, of course, is that it's harder to say that caning is justified for that, for just handing over your bank details. It is certainly an offense, and it should be, but one wonders whether it's so serious, it plays such a tangible effect as to warrant caning. Now, that having been said, well, it's always difficult to address crime that is carried out with a certain overseas element. And again, we should stress that criminal punishment is just part of the puzzle, right? There are all sorts of other tools that any government could have in its toolbox, from regulating what can be posted on the internet, requiring, say, social media service providers to be on the lookout for scam messages and have a system to remove them quickly, and that sort of thing.
I see. Well, scam victims in Singapore lost a record $1.1 billion in 2024, according to annual scam figures released by the police on February 25th. Now, this is the first time scam losses crossed the $1 billion mark in a year. So, Professor, will the fear of, this kind of severe punishment of caning significantly reduce scam activities? Will this move send a clear message to scammers that the government will not be going soft on these offenses?
Well, it will certainly send a message, but will the message make a difference? I would be cautious. I'm not that optimistic. Because if we're talking about the sort of scams that are carried on from overseas, like electronic means, where the scammers aren't physically present in Singapore and no one physically present in Singapore is involved, then it's difficult because you simply have no one within Singapore to punish, right? Except people who play a rather indirect role, such as handing over the SingPass details and then the scam proceeds are laundered through the Singapore bank accounts. But then you wonder, do you really want to introduce caning for that? So you'll certainly be sending a message that Singapore won't be going soft on scams, but realistically, how many people from these huge international scamming networks could be sentenced to punishment in Singapore? I suspect it's fairly few. Now, of course, you would still have smaller time scams that take place in Singapore, right? From the sometimes you see people who put up these ads for fake concert tickets and they scam someone of a couple of $100s, or it could be something more widespread. And certainly that would send a message that we're not going soft on them. But I do wonder whether all of those offences would necessarily be so serious as to warrant caning. So I suppose, again, in terms of reducing scam activities, we can't just consider criminal punishment. We've got to consider it in the context of a whole universe of things. Speaking for myself, one law that might make a difference could be some kind of fines, perhaps, for social media platforms if they don't have an adequate system to stop scams. Right? Things like this, I think, we've got to consider them and not just this idea of caning the scammers.
I see. Well, thank you so much, Professor, for your time and your insights today.
Thank you so much for having me, Hongbin.
Thank you. That was Benjamin Joshua Ong, Assistant Professor of Law at Yong School of Law at the Singapore Management University. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.